So dear friends, since so many of you have asked me to record more educational type of podcasts on specific topics, I thought port wine would be one of the most timely one, considering the upcoming D5 Diploma exams in January. Jorge Nunes, my guest today, is the regional manager of the Symington family estates in Asia, providing deep insider knowledge about the making of port wine as well as about the trade itself. Jorge has already appeared on the Wine Goes podcast in the 66th episode when he gave tips about passing the diploma with an A, and I must say he is an excellent communicator and professional. You can learn about the varieties, the vineyard work in the Douro, the different extraction methods and styles, the contradiction around the Beneficio, and about current market trends regarding port wine. I learned a lot and I hope you will do the same. To be able to continue making these episodes in the future and keep the Wine Goes podcast alive, you can help support the channel with a small monthly contribution on Patreon via the link in the description. In return for only $4 a month, you get to know my guest list in advance. You get to submit your own questions for them, as well as joining our monthly remote drinking evening when we talk, drink and share our favorite wines with a passionate circle. Any help is greatly appreciated. But now, enjoy this episode and learn about port wine. So, Jorge, good to see you again, man. Thanks for taking the time.
Good to see you, Mate. It's been a while. Thanks for having me again.
If listeners haven't listened to the first episode we recorded with Jorge, it's worth listening to, especially if you're studying for the WSET Diploma, because Jorge was an exceptional student and he gave a lot of tips for students like me to pass the diploma successfully. But now we approach another topic, which Jorge is an expert of, basically. Can you talk a little bit about your background?
Sure. I'm born in Porto in a wine family company, not particularly very good company, to be honest, in terms of quality. Studied winemaking to try to improve it. Didn't quite work out in terms of the business. I studied in the Douro Valley, at the ONL's university there. And then after 1 year in a different experience, I joined the Symington family, which is, definitely one of the great port houses and port names. A number of port houses under our umbrella, and we can dive into that as well. I had a mixed job of winemaking and sales for a certain period of time. Eventually, it became a full-on sales work. And I've been doing the Asia Pacific for the Symingtons for now close to 15 years, but based first in Hong Kong for 10 years, and I moved last year to Singapore. So basically now regional manager for the company. So in terms of background winemaking, not just on the port, but even on the Douro, still wines involved. But if you would ask me what my expertise would be, I would say the region and the sales now of the export business.
So, Jorge, from a professional standpoint, what would you say which are the critical factors what makes actually port wine so special, and why is it so different in the fortified wine segment of the wine world?
Okay, well, let me see if I can break it down into different sectors, because obviously there's quite a few things to touch base on. I would start by saying that port is a fortified, starting with the basics. So port is a fortified wine. It's fortified with other famous stuff, sherry, Madeiras, and Sour, the VDNs of this world. And fortification means strengthening, that's where the name comes from. So as all the other ones, there is the element of alcohol addition, a spirit, usually an addition of spirit to the wines. In the case of port, the addition of spirit happens halfway through the fermentation. So there are others, like for the sherry, that happen at the end. In our case, it happens really halfway through the fermentation. So we stop the fermentation by killing the yeasts and keeping the residual sugar. And the timing of the addition makes a big difference. That's one of the reasons why different house styles will come through. It's obviously because of the vineyards, no doubt, but it's also because of the sweetness style. So if you stop the fermentation earlier, you tend to have a sweeter style because you kept more residual sugar. For example, this would be the Grand Sport style. If you let it ferment a bit longer, you're going to end up with lower residual sugar and a drier style. This would be the Dow's style, for example. And so depending on where you stop it, you add a higher level of spirit or lower level of spirit. And I think this is an important aspect of the quality of the spirit, right? So we use 77% alcohol, grape origin, so wine distilled, neutral, colorless spirit, and freshly distilled. Because it is 77% alcohol, unlike other fortifieds, which are closer to 96%, we tend, and also because we have higher alcohol than others, tend to be on a higher scale of the fortified world with usually 20% alcohol. We do have a higher proportion of spirit added than other fortifieds. And so I'm jumping already here in terms of sort of profile and blind tasting, but if you are trying to identify a port, if it is quite spirity, if you do notice the aguardente, the eau de vie, if you want, so the spirity side, that tends to be more of the port profile than other fortifieds. So in terms of winemaking, port isn't a complicated wine to make in the winery. It's naturally stable. No more re-fermentation happens. Malolactic really doesn't happen post-fortification because, obviously bacteria doesn't quite develop there anymore. Yeast, so forget about any re-fermentation issues. So even in terms of stabilization of the product, port is a naturally stable product. So even there, port is an easy wine to make. The difficult bit is what happens in the vineyard. Because I'm not sure if I can't remember, Mate, have you been to the Douro?
No, not yet, unfortunately.
I probably did last time, and I invite you again. I strongly recommend you to pay a visit to the Douro Valley and everyone that is listening. It truly is a stunning place. But stunning is great to look at. To grow the grapes, it's not so much because it is the largest mountain vineyard in the world. Very difficult to tame the mountains and the steepness into farmable land. Does the terraced vineyards. And it's a pretty inhospitable place. It's continental climate. We get, particularly if you go further east, you get 40, 45 degrees. I think we got 48 Celsius this summer. And in the winter it's -5. Snow is possible, and very dry. And so if you, on top of that, you've got, on top of all the sort of terrain, you've got really complicated conditions for vines to grow. So fortunately, the authorized varieties are very suitable for the terrain. And not all of them are good. We have a few selected grapes that I'm sure we'll be talking about. So it's all these varieties are really the secret, say. Mm-hmm. I think some people have tried planting other varieties, and they do tend to struggle. And I think one aspect I'd like to touch base on when I'm talking about port is that people think about port immediately as a sweet high alcohol. And I always say, don't forget about the concentration. The concentration of flavor is greater than most wines because of, again, the heat, the drought, and the natural loneliness. And that's a key component of the port profile. It's richness of flavors, not just the sweetness, not just the alcohol, but richness of flavor. Very much in a nutshell, and I'm sure we're going to dive into more details here, but this is kind of a nice overview.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. And also the grapes, obviously the 5 main grapes, they are kind of critical to know, but I'm sure we can also dive into maybe other grapes like Tinta Amarela, which is not or Suasao, which are not among the 5 basic ones. But first, let's concentrate on the 5 main ones. So what is the most important one? And what are the most important ones, and why? What is the critical quality of these grapes? What makes them perfectly suited to the region and for the production of port?
So the most famous is Touriga Nacional. That is the one that grabs the attention, and I think justifiably, because it does produce really spectacular wines. It is not, however, the most planted. The plantings are growing, so you will see a lot of the vines being replaced with Touriga Nacional progressive. That is happening, but it's still a small proportion. Actually, I don't have the updated figures, but it's still below Touriga Franca, which is the widest planted. Tinta Barroca and Tinta Roriz, for instance. So these three are more widely planted than Touriga Nacional. Touriga Nacional is a variety that produces wines incredibly deep color. So they're black purple colors. That's an indication. Few varieties get to sort of black purple color. Touriga Nacional does that. Tends to be very small berries, so very thick skin, so high ratio skin juice. So you get a lot of tannin, get a lot of a lot of color, a lot of tannin. Naturally high acidity, even considering the region, and a lot of black fruit, as you would expect from a pretty hot climate, but also a typical violet, sort of flowery bergamot is also another one that's, or rock rose, which is not, it's very typical for me, to be honest, to actually know what it smells like, but that's kind of the in the books, if you want. But violets, for sure, the very typical aroma of Touriga Nacional. So really powerful grape, and gives us a lot of backbone, a lot of structure. And when we get to vintage port levels, Touriga Nacional is a fundamental base to produce wine. The other great variety I would probably say would be Touriga Franca. Touriga Franca, in terms of ripening, Touriga Nacional tends to be a early mid-ripening. Touriga Franca tends to be a little bit later ripening. And it is a grape variety that is also deep color. It's not as deep, it is very deep color. Tends to be a little fleshier, a little richer. It might sound a bit weird, but it's almost like the Merlot in a Bordeaux blend, in the left bank, if you want. So that sort of fills up the holes that Touriga Nacional might have. Touriga Nacional might be a bit austere sometimes. Touriga Franca gives it a bit of mouthfeel, a bit of richness. And because it is the most widely planted, it is fundamental for across different ranges. So it provides flesh for wines that are a little bit easier drinking, but it provides the flesh also to the top wines as well. You vary more the Touriga Nacional level according to where you are in the spectrum of quality of port, rather than Touriga Franca. Because Touriga Nacional, there's less of it, so we do tend to focus Nacional on the higher ones. Tinta Barroca produces wines that are high sugar, so a lot of potential alcohol. Ripens really early. It's usually the first one to get into the winery. So a lot of fruit, not a lot of backbone, not a lot of acidity. Really good for everyday ports. Gives juiciness, gives fruit. Never really quite gets to the level of vintage port. And then Tinta Roriz would be the fourth main one. And that one tends to be, it's Tempranillo. It's a very different clones, but it is Tempranillo. So if you know your theory from Spain, temprano, so early ripening, so tends to be harvested more or less at the same time as Touriga Nacional, and it produces wines more red fruited, and they can be quite tannic. So it's usually quite good for blending and giving a bit of structure, but composing a little bit of the red black fruit with some more red fruit. Those four truly are the main ones. Then, of course, you've got Tintucão, which is a pretty late. It's usually harvested after the Touriga Franca. Tintucão, not a lot of people use a lot of Tintucão. It's more about because of the acidity retention. It works quite well. The Tinta Amarela, a little also sort of similar to Tintucão, doesn't always quite get into the blend. So when we talk about the main 5 varieties, often, so I heard people saying Tinta Amarela, I heard people say Tucão, so it always depends a bit.
Okay.
And Tinta Amarela has the issue of being quite disease prone, very compact bunches, but it gives some sort of herbaceous aromas. Could have some good structures and good tannins as well, so very good in blends. And then you've got 2 varieties that are more recent in terms of their use in blends, which is the Sauzão and the Alicante Boucher. You start to see a lot more of these 2 being used. Sauzão has been around for a long time. Alicante Boucher is more recent. But they provide high acid, a lot of color. Those are the 2 main reasons why we use these. So in a nutshell, this is the red varieties. The white varieties is a completely different spectrum, and it's a much smaller spectrum of grape varieties. And Muscatel Gallego, which is Muscat Blanc Petit Grain, it's the same grape, makes a pretty big component in the blends. You've got Vinhozinho, you've got Rebigato, you've got Malvasia Fina, of course, you've got Gouveio, the Godelho. These are sort of the 5 main ones. But whites, we tend to talk less about what the grape varieties produce in the blends, because the styles of white are far more reduced. And so it tends to be more of a how much muscatel are you going to add for flavor rather than anything. Hopefully that gives sort of an overview of it.
Yeah, sure. If you want to maybe conceptualize the grape varieties, I think it's a very useful analogy what you provided with the kind of Cabernet Sauvignon is more like a Touriga Nacional, right? In terms of structure, and also that would be Touriga Franca, maybe a Cabernet Franc or a Merlot, a bit more luscious and not as backbony, so to say, or not as structured. I think a lot of people would remember these varieties more consistently and better in terms of these comparisons. And also about the Vineyard Work, because you also already touched on this beautiful area, which I'm surely going to visit. But other than the beauty, I think there are some aspects which are critical probably in the vineyard. Also because of this heroic viticulture, basically what they are doing there, about the hand harvest and about the soil types. Can you talk a little bit about this specialty?
So it is we talked about the climate. We talk about rainfall. Just to give you an idea, it starts about 1,000 millimeters of rainfall-ish on the west part, on the Baixo Corgo. So there's 3 subregions: Baixo Corgo, Cima Corgo, Douro Superior. So the Baixo Corgo, the most western part, still a bit more Atlantic influenced. So you're a bit rainier, a little cooler. And then you jump into the Cima Corgo, tends to be considered as the prime area for port, and rainfall probably around the 600, 700 millimeters a year. And then you go into the Douro Superior, so further east towards Spain, and there are areas with 300 millimeters of rainfall. So it's pre-desert conditions. So quite a big variability in terms of weather. In terms of soil, the Douro is a bit more homogeneous. So schist is the main type of soil that we have. There are pockets of granite that actually, if the granite proportion is higher, is of a certain percentage, that area sits outside of the Douro Valley already. So there are areas where you're not allowed to grow because the percentage of granite is higher than the percentage of schist. So schist is we believe, at least this is historical in the port world. Schist is the base for what we're looking for in the port world. Very low organic matter. But it's built, so the bedrock is built vertically, and so if you pick up a bit of schist and you can actually sort of hit it on the floor, it actually breaks into leaves. You can see those different layers, and that allows, even though it's incredibly poor in organic matter, it allows the roots of the vines to grow really deep, several meters down. to underground water reserves, when there are, and get the water they need. And of course, there's always the element of the color. It's quite a dark rock, so ripeness during the night as well. So that element comes into fruition as well. So the other element, and I mentioned before, the concentration comes from the lower yields. Irrigation is now allowed. I think it's an important development in the region. So it is allowed to have, we Symington, we have now a substantial number of hectares of vineyard with drip irrigation installed. So it still needs a permit. So we still need to go through the IVDP, the Douro and Port Wine Institute, to make sure that we're following the rules of the DOC in terms of water use. But it is allowed, and so I personally believe it is a good development for the region. But naturally, so there's no real reason in the Douro to do green harvest, because naturally our yields are very, very low. We're talking on average about 3,000 liters per hectare, versus a Burgundy, which is 5,000. So this is the average of the region. So we're not even talking about the old vines or the top locations, and so those low yields lead to that very rich, very concentrated, and in high sugar, we have to admit, in high sugar sort of grapes at the time of the harvest. The viticulture is heroic. Yes, it is, because it is. I'm not going to say it's impossible to mechanize. It is possible to mechanize, and the building of the terraces allows a small tractor to go around that row. If you plant vineyards below 30 degrees, if you have a lower than 30 degrees steep hill, you can actually plant what we call vinha ao alto. That's vertical vineyards. So that is very much mechanizable. So you can have a machine. You can even, if you wanted, you can actually. If it's probably a little lower than that, but you could machine harvest. The issue really is a scale. How much hectares of vertical vineyard would you need to have to justify purchasing a harvesting machine? That's the issue. So that's why if you would look at it from a conceptual point of view, yes, you could mechanize parts of it. From a financial point of view, would you? Probably not, because you would have to put up front a high cost for the harvesting machine for no reason. And that's why 99.99% of the vineyards are hand harvested, for instance. A small tractor can go into the vineyard, and if you need, if you're spraying, whatever, you can do that. Harvesting is a different experience altogether. And so we are, at least that I'm aware of, we are Symington pioneering a harvesting machine, which is already working, and we were working with it, this vineyard. With some pretty good results, trying to sort of having a parallel arm that goes around the terrace, the row next to the actual terrace, and just vibrates and picks and does it really well. So that may be a new thing that will help with the region, because otherwise we have to rely on thousands and thousands during the harvest to do a pretty hard work, which is carrying 25 kilo boxes on their backs and back-breaking stuff with very hot conditions. So not easy, and thus your term was completely justified, considering what the conditions really are.
And the other two vineyard layouts, which was one you were already mentioning, Vinha Alto, and the other two are Socalcos and Patamares. What are the advantages and disadvantages and the for these other two layouts?
So starting with the Vinha Alto that we were talking before. So the vertical vineyard, Vinha Alto, is, like I said, below 30 degrees. You could do that. Like I said, mechanizable, higher density plantation if you need. You could probably do 5,000 to 6,000 vines per hectare there. The big issue is erosion, because if you have a vertical vineyard, you end up with rain, with wind, just feeling that erosion happening. So you do have to, dirt up occasionally to rebuild that. That's one of the issues. If you have a higher grade than that, then Patamar is currently the modern option. When I say modern, it's from the 70s, early 80s, when the Patamars were introduced. Basically, it's a bulldozer that goes in and builds terraces by machine. No stone walls. So it's just basically land, creating these terraces, varying in size, but you will see the door maybe from maybe 2 meters to about 5, 6. Sometimes it's a little bit bigger. And each terrace is built either on 1 row or 2 rows. And that also usually depends on the steepness as well. The higher the steepness, let's say above 45 degrees, it tends to have 1 row only, while sort of the more intermediate steepness tends to have 2. There are a lot of discussions here, because if you think about it, a terrace is built inwards, so that the water doesn't flow out, and that would cause erosion. It flows in, and then it's drained on the side of the other terrace. So if you think about it, the terrace inside is much more fertile than the row inside is much more fertile than the row outside, because the water is going its way. And so it creates a little unbalance within 2 rows that are next to each other. So it's not perfect. That's why a lot of people prefer to build 1 row per terrace. At least you have a sort of consistency across the various terraces.
And also another argument, or in terms of what the book states, that the sun exposure is also not the same if you have 2 rows, because on the outside row you have, of course, much more intense sunlight exposure.
Absolutely, well thought. It's exactly right. So again, one further element of inconsistency. I know we can all talk about, it's great to have variability within a vineyard. Like, yes, absolutely, but not within the same parcels. It's basically the same harvesting thing. And if you have one which is much more green with a much more vegetative growth than the other one, and one is more sun exposure, then your canopy management needs to be completely reformulated. And so it's a bit of a challenge. And thus there's a few antagonizing, contrasting opinions amongst viticulturists. I'm not a viticulturist, so I tend to stay away from that and just state the facts. But I know that there are a few that prefer one way and the other one. But the reality is this does tend to happen. Erosion obviously is lower, but density of plantation tends to be quite low as well. So your yield will eventually. It depends. Obviously, the roots will tend to be a little bit bigger, and perhaps you can compensate per vine. But it does tend to be a slightly lower yield on that than compared to the Pinot. The Sucalcos are the historical. So the Sucalcos were terraces, but man-made stone walls, and so those are still historical. And wherever they exist, we have to keep them. We have to maintain them. Part of the UNESCO World Heritage Site mandates. So we have a lot of issues with storms and spring storms. They can be quite complicated, and so it breaks away all those walls. We have to rebuild them. It's just part of the heritage. And they're less easily mechanizable. They actually tend to have a slightly higher density of plantation coming up than the Patamars, but it's very hard to mechanize. And it's one of the big challenges with the Sucalcos. But it's part of the landscape. So it's the historical bit.
And after these heroes managed to bring all these grapes into the winery, one of the critical aspects would be the handling of the juice and the extraction, right? Because you have not a lot of time to extract all those beautiful color and all those beautiful flavors from the grapes. So can you talk a little bit about the extraction techniques? Because I think this is also one of the key elements in the port wine making.
You said it well, Mattia, and I think that's the key thing about port wine making. I said before it was easy, right? But there is one difficulty, which is time. Because when we fortify, we press. We're pressing the skins off the juice, and we're fortifying the juice. and then the press the juice as well. But we don't have a lot of time to extract what we need from the skins. And so historically, you've all studied, or even if you haven't studied wines, you've probably heard of the Portuguese, the treading, the feet treading. We still use it in the lagar, the open tank, stone, traditionally granites or concrete, a few. And so these traditionally were filled up during the picking day, and then the same people that were harvesting would go into the tank for about 3-4 hours and really tread the grapes. The reason why we do this is still a very good way to make forwards, because the lagan allows you to increase the ratio of skin to juice contact rather than a typical stainless steel tank, fermentation tank, which is more cylindrical, more vertical, which has a more reduced area of skin and juice. So the lagan allows a fast, effective treading and extraction over a very short period of time. And it's the only real way of getting to a color like what you would see in a young vintage port, which is just super black, inky color. You wouldn't be able to extract that on normal fermentation. Remember we did a few tests. Sorry, let me open another topic, which is the modern ways of doing it. There are a number of wineries doing different methods. The Symingtons use a robotic lagar, a fully stainless steel mechanized tank, temperature control with silicone feet, brushes with about 70 kilos pressure, can go all the way down. The tread can just punch down, so not actually, so during fermentation cap goes up. All we need is to punch down a bit. So it has those two levels of work, works really well. A few others, for example, Taylor, they do an adapted on stone lagar with a robotic punch down mechanism. So every port house has kind of a different approach to it. When we did this, and this is, I joined the company a while ago, almost 17 years ago. When I was in the beginning, I remember we were showing wines made in traditional lagar, same grapes, literally same grapes. We vinified it in 3 different ways, and we were comparing. And we were doing a traditional lagar, granite, stainless steel, robotic lagar, and plunger tank. And the plunger tank is basically a cylindrical tank, but rather than relying on pumping overs, we were relying on a hydraulic arm that would come down and touch that. And from the 3 of them, the plunger tank was the lowest color. You could see it very clearly. The same level, the same grapes you would expect a lot less. And then between the other 2, the differences were very minute. And so we were, it was clear that the lagar was the most effective way. Traditional, robotic, kind of really sort of, regardless of the format, the result was very similar. So we knew that we had a winning formula. There are other ways. And so lagars tend to focus on grapes that have the quality to give you a premium port, a late bottle vintage upwards. If you're producing volume, if you're producing ruby, fine tonic, fine white with volumes, there are other ways. For example, a pumping over tank, or the auto vinificators, which is the one that uses the release of CO2 to automatically create basically releases CO2 by releasing the pressure. Juice comes out on the skins, and you've got an automatic. You don't have to do anything. And that tends to sort of be a little harsher.
Okay.
But because we don't, we focus a lot more on the entry level. It is okay that we don't have the same sort of fine, deep extraction that you get from a lagar. So we're quite happy in focusing on malts. So those are usually the methods of vinification you see in the brewery. Don't think that everybody does lagar, because lagars, tends either they were expensive to make if they're stainless steel, or they rely a lot on human labor. And so not all grapes have the quality to justify that level of investment. And so there is a lot of port produced in Aguardente than normal stainless steel.
And is the temperature play a critical role in that extraction? Because you also mentioned that in Symington you have this temperature controlled vat for that.
Yeah, for sure. I didn't mention that. Going back a little bit further, I think most of we do stem 100%. I'm sure there are a few producers that leave partial, full stems. I don't know personally, but we do stem 100%. Natural fermentation is the norm in the donor for port. That I know of, no one really inoculates with yeasts for port. So, but again, I won't say nobody does it because I can't speak for other producers. We don't. It's all natural fermentation. Temperature is a really important aspect of port because at higher temperatures, as you know, you increase the degrading or the destruction of the skin cells and the extraction level. So at higher alcohol, particularly when you get to a certain level of fermentation, at higher alcohol, if you manage to increase the temperature, you will be able to extract more stuff. Yes, you might lose some flavors, particularly in an open tank. That does happen, and fermentation tends to be a bit more vigorous at higher temperature. But it is really fundamental to achieve that. A normal lagar without temperature control can go up to 32, 33 degrees. So we do tend to prefer somewhere around 28, 29, perhaps 30. So we do tend to cool down our lagar to achieve that temperature. So if you go up too much, then temperature increases too fast. So the fermentation rate increases fast, and you end up with less time to extract. If you ferment at too low temperature, you're not maximizing your level of extraction. So we do believe that 28 to 30 is the right level to extract and give us the time to extract. We don't have issues in the port world. We don't have issues like stuck fermentations because we want to stop it anyway. We want the fermentation at some point to be stuck. That's the point of fortification. So even if temperatures get increased a little bit high, we're not going to have an issue with yeasts halfway through fermentation.
And do you typically do the fortification after 2 days?
Yeah, correct. So we press when we measure the sugar level and we say this is the moment. We also have an idea of what the potential alcohol is already in that must, because we knew the initial sugar. We know the sugar we want for this house style. The difference will have created X% of alcohol, which means that from X to 19 or 20%, that's the spirit that we need to add. It's a kind of an easy calculation there. And then we rack the juice out, usually by gravity. It's amazing to think that port has, wineries with 200 years were already worked under gravity, which is quite cool. So if you will look at the lagar jar above, and then we'll go into another room, and all the big vats are below. So by gravity, the juice is brought down into these pulsators, these gigantic barrels, and the spirit is being pumped into that big vat at the same time. So you're immediately homogenizing, you're immediately stopping the fermentation. The skins are then either shoveled out of work, trust me, out of a traditional stone tank, or if it's a robotic one, you press a button, hydraulic arm raises, and the skins can be easily sent into a screw and then pumped into the press. One of the big differences in the port world compared to other ones is that we love our press wine. Sometimes there's still a lot in the grapes that we would like for our wine. And so we really tend to press, high pressing, and use that juice, that must immediately fortified, and often sort of added immediately to the racked juice, because it's just going to bring that extra element of tannin power, flavor. And so we tend to use continuous press for port, not so much pneumatic. Don't know if anyone is using pneumatic presses for port. Usually it's just a continuous. It's quite severe.
And do you do that for all kind of ports, for all styles?
Usually, yes. Even for vintage port, for example, you probably would expect, vintage probably are careful with pressing. No, probably vintage we need to do even more. Because we need that extra texture, body, flavor, tannin. And press wine brings you all that. So it is a key element for backbone.
And is the Aguardente more aromatic than other spirits used for fortified wines? And does it come mostly from the region or somewhere else?
So it does tend to have a bit more aroma than others. And the more you distill, the more purity you get. And thus, a 96% spirit, even if it's the same origin, tends to be more neutral than a 77%. So we do tend to be a bit more. There's a bit more aroma we want on the port spirit than in other spirits for other fortifieds. And in terms of sourcing, it's a yeast. So it actually doesn't necessarily need to be Portuguese. For a while, we did use from France, from Cognac. We have changed that 2 years ago to be Portuguese spirits. So now we have Portuguese suppliers, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's from the Douro. There are a few distilleries in the Douro, but if you think about the financials, if you're producing 3,000 liters on average of an expensive region, a really expensive region to grow grapes, far more than people think when they look at the prices of Douro and port. And if you think you have low yield at high price, if you're going to distill that, your spirit price is off the charts, and then you end up with a port price on the shelf, which doesn't work. And so there was there's a few producers a few years ago that wanted port 100% in the Douro Valley, which is a very noble request. Or quest actually. It's a very noble quest. But the reality is that we're not there yet, if ever. We just cannot produce at the sort of price that the market would accept. And so at the moment we're sourcing from Portugal, which is great, high quality, as neutral as we can at that level of alcohol, and fresh distilled, and we're very happy with the quality now, which is far greater than it was 30 years ago or so. But having it 100% from the Douro is not viable for the time being, financially.
So where do you source these grapes? Where do you source these grape spirits now?
Out of the spirit. The spirit has a few distilleries in, for example, the Lisboa region, so Tejo area, large volumes there, big flat land, high yields, exactly the sort of stuff that we're looking for at low cost, which is important. Again, it's the alcohol tends to be a question about, very much asked about in WSET, and people tend to focus a lot on that. It shouldn't be that important, because it is obviously a critical element of fortifieds, but it's not important. It's just there to create a sweet style, not there to add an extra dimension. It does, obviously, but that's not the point. But I think from a theory point of view, it always gets quite a lot of attention.
Yeah. Cool. And then the general maturation, because it's also very important for port, right? Where do you store this stuff, and how do you age it? What are the most important factors there to know, and the differentiating factors?
Sure. So after the wine is made, let's say September or October, it stays one winter in the Douro Valley. So from October till about March, we leave the wines in large wood vats or stainless steel tanks. And the natural low temperature of the Douro allows a sort of, you could say a cold stabilization of the product. It's a bit of an exaggeration to call it that way, but that's kind of what happens. But at the end of March, April, we ship the wines from the Douro down to Gaia on the coast.
Mhm.
It's Atlantic climate, higher humidity, milder temperature. The wines tend to age a bit lighter. The same better, just different opinions. But the wines tend to age a little more gracefully and slower in Gaia than they would in the Douro. And there's less evaporation as well. So the evaporation level in the Douro, because of the humidity, would be a lot higher. We will lose a lot more. So we age at Symington. We age 100% in Gaia. Once the wines arrive, we have a first assessment of what the wines are, and this is all very flexible. We tend to sort of explain the different styles very much by how they age, but it's very flexible. It's a very dynamic system. The wines can change vessels if they are going, through a different stage, or they're kind of telling us, well, this is more of a tonic than a ruby. It is quite flexible. But the idea is that if you want to create a ruby port style, which is the young, dark, fruity style, then you don't want it to oxidize. You want to retain its properties. And for that, you want the least oxygen contact possible. So you go with large wood vats. You have less wood contact. The wines they keep for longer. So we're talking 10,000, 20, 50, 100,000 liter wood vats. These gigantic tanks, oak or chestnut. I've seen both. There might be a different woods. We're talking very old, seasoned wood. They're not giving any flavor. It's just a deposit. But if you want the wines to become a tonic, then you want tonic color, which is the oxidized version. You've got these caramel, dry fruit, much lighter color. Then you want as much oxygen as possible within the Douro reality. And so you put these wines into 550 to 600 liter oak barrels. You increase the oak contact, more air comes into the wine. The wines age much faster. Again, seasoned old barrels, oak, almost 100%, 100%. So oak seasoned casks. And this is what red wines go through. This is the red wine. So you have the same base wine. You can actually have it for ruby and have it for tonic, depending on where the vessel goes to. And then the way that we classify the wines tends to be on a declassification level. So, for instance, the great wine that we do is the vintage port, and we decide a vintage port release up to 2 years after the harvest. Not even 2 years, 20 months or so. So by March or April, the second year, we assess the wine and we say that is vintage port. So we bottle it soon after. So even less than 2 years after the harvest, we are bottling that wine without any fining or filtration. But if we taste the wine and we go, doesn't quite have it, let's leave it. And a few years later, usually 2, 3, we taste the wines and we say, okay, does it have what it takes to be a late bottle? Does the name bottle later than it is? And if it does, great. Start bottling, filter, unfilter, depending on the style. If it's not, then the wine is already sort of 5, 6, 7 years. We go, okay, well then, what do we do with it? Let's try and make it a tonic. Why not? So it's very flexible, right? To try and play with this. The wine kind of tells us, I want to be a tonic, or I want to be a ruby. And we just need to work our way around what the wine is telling us and drive it into the different categories.
Very well explained. Thank you. It's much clearer than most of the explanation what I heard. And also other ways to control the oxidation. It's what the book is mentioning is racking and the top-up levels of the barrels. How often do you use that? Or how common is that? Or how much attention do you pay to that one?
I look, obviously, and this is one of those cases that it's not just a port phenomenon. It's any oxidized product. The bigger the headspace in a barrel, the more oxygen you're incorporating. I think if you want to create a very rancio style, very
Mm-hmm.
thick style, you would leave that headspace quite often, and
Mm-hmm.
probably on purpose. That's not the case necessarily on the port world. We do tend to top up, and racking is actually not that particularly common either.
Mm-hmm.
Again, the more you rack, when you rack, you're obviously you're taking some of the leaves out, which have reductive power, and you're incorporating oxygen into it. But leaves also add some texture, so that's fine, finally. And at that age, then we're talking definitely about very fine leaves. So it's not that common for headspace to be left uncontrolled. We do tend to try and top up. It's not as important as a still wine, dry wine, because of volatile acidity issues. We don't have that problem. But we also don't want too much space in the barrel that it becomes oxidized too fast. If you taste a port, a 20-year-old port, and you compare it, for example, with, there are other factors, mind you, but if you compare it to an Aussie tawny style, they're much thicker. They're much thicker than we are. Yes, there's more evaporation. So obviously, they age in pretty dry conditions, but much more rancid. And I believe, again, actually, I am not entirely certain, but I do believe because of the headspace is a bit more for that extra evaporation, that extra oxidation. We don't do that.
So what would be maybe the indication for you when you classify these kind of wines, if you want to do a vintage port? Because basically this is the most celebrated style, right? And those are most long-lived. So what are you looking for?
Look, a vintage port happens once every 4 years. There are a few guys making it every year. Quinta do Noval, for example, is producing Quinta do Noval vintage every year, but they have reduced quantity. They're producing smaller volumes every year. So again, whether you would say it's an exceptional year or not, you still have to limit your volume to make sure that what you bottle as vintage is of top quality. So different approaches. We do once every 4 years, but we produce a bit more what we do. And what we're looking for is a wine that, look, let me put it this way. It's the fine wine of the port. So when we talk about tawnies and late bottle vintages and reserves and whatever, we don't really talk about terroir. We don't talk about properties. We don't talk about the climatic conditions. Even a late bottle vintage, which is a single year, the amount we talk about what happened in that climatic year is not that high. We touch on it, but nothing particularly important for the style. For vintage, it's all about what we had in that particular year. The conditions, the level of ripeness, the harvest time, the acidity, and so on. And so it's a very much a wine conversation more than a port conversation. And we need what a great red wine needs to age well. We need balance. That's probably the key fundamental thing. Obviously, for us, with the added dimensions of alcohol and sugar, we still want a very balanced wine from the start. But we need deep color, massive tannins, massive fruit component, full body for sure, and just power. It's an excess of a lot of things. If you have the opportunity to try a young vintage port, I think you all should. Delicious stuff. You can drink it immediately because there's so much body around the tannin structure that you actually don't feel that much tannic. But they're there. They're very much there. Because those are the elements that will allow the wine to age for decades. And it's the structure, it's the tannin, it's the fruit component, and it's the balance that it has. So that's what we're looking for. If it's missing one of those elements, then it's not going to be a vintage. There is a single quinta vintage. Single quinta, which is they tend to happen on the years that we didn't release the declared vintage. The top line. The top line is from, and I'm talking here about main port houses, is the result of blending the different properties, the best of different properties, and that's the icon one. In the years when we didn't do a vintage port declare, our top line is the single Quinta. So we bottle it as one individual property. Wonderful stuff, great value for money. Top line of that year, but they do tend to mature a little faster. They don't have the extra components of the other. In a blind tasting, it's not easy to pick which is which. But if the student was tasting wine thinking very high quality, massive wine, chances are it's a declared vintage. If it's very high quality, but a little softer, rounded, approachable, while youthful, that's probably something.
And if we go back from, I don't really want to say from quality backwards, but maybe price backwards. What are the different styles what you make?
No, it depends on the style, right? If you're in the ruby style, it would be vintage port, single Quinta vintage port. Then there's a very tiny category called crusted, which I don't think WSET touches on, so I'll forget about that one. Pretty cool product, but a rarity. Then you've got two categories that can be a bit confusing in terms of positioning. Usually, late bottle vintage comes up to the single Quinta, and then the reserve ruby, and then the entry level ruby. There are one or two producers that put the reserve ruby above the late bottle vintage. Grams is an example. So the 6th grade reserve is above the late bottle vintage in terms of price positioning, but usually the LBV is above. If you look at the tawnies, it's an age statement. You've got the 50-year-old now. It's a very recent addition to the port category. You've got 50, 40, 30, 20, 10 reserve tawny, entry level tawny. And then you've got the Cudeta, which is a single harvest, which is a tawny, single year. And the price positioning really depends on how old the Cudeta is, where it sits on the spectrum of age. But there's no limit of age. So 7 years plus, and that's a reserve tawny. And then whites have their own thing, but I don't think the WSET cares much for the white. You've got the entry-level white, you've got the extra dry, the dry white. And then you've got a 10, 20, a 30, a 40, single harvest. So they have their own categories within the whites. Very niche. Few producers do. Lovely products, but very niche.
Because it's also very confusing for a lot of people, or actually for consumers, if I work with these wines, that they think that if you drink a 20-year-old tawny, it's actually 20 years old. Or was 20 years old when it was bottled. It is not the case. Can you explain the method or the indications?
Yeah, so if you look at a port bottle, you will notice, you will have to open it. You can kind of see it from the outside, but to be certain, you have to open it. You'll notice that port comes in with two different stoppers. The driven cork and what we call a T-top, a technical cork, which is the one with small little wood or plastic top. That is the big difference in terms of wines that can age, wines that can't age. A vintage port, a single Quinta vintage port, crusted, and a traditionally bottled late bottle vintage comes with a drip. That means unfined, unfiltered, bottled naturally, should be kept lying down, ages beautifully, throws sediment, should be decanted before serving, consumed in 2 or 3 days. The T-top is what you will find in 99.9% of ports. That's the LBV, most LBVs, reserves, entry levels, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, Cudetas. They all have the T-top. And the T-top means the wines were filtered before, or at least they had a fining process that removed sediment. You should keep it upright. And it's ready to drink. Because of that fining and that filtration process, and because the oxidation happened in large vats or wood barrel, it doesn't have the same ability to age. We want you guys as consumers to drink the wine as soon as you buy the bottle. these can be kept open for 2-3 months once you open. No need to decant it.
Mm.
But they don't get better with age. So if every bottle 10, 20, 30, 40, or 50, you will find the bottling date either on the label or the back label. Mandatory needs the bottling date. Try to buy the closest bottling date as possible. So if you find a 2023 20-year-old, buy that. So a 20-year-old in 2033 is not going to be a 30-year-old. It's a 20-year-old. You just waited 10 years to drink it, and you gain nothing from it. So buy, drink. That's it. Shelf life, many years, but it's not getting better. That's the point. That's the big
one. And also the indication is mostly like a tasting profile, right? What you aim for.
Yeah, it is a strange concept in a way, but it is an organoleptic, a stylistic classification. So if it, for every bottling, and not just for aged tonics, for every bottling that we do, there needs to be an IVDP. Again, the Portlandora Wine Institute. There needs to be an authorization that bottling will fit into the style that we are bottling. And so when we're doing a 20-year-old, and we say we want to, we had a blend, 20-year-old, we made the blend, ready to bottle, send a sample, and they need to say it looks, it smells, tastes like a 20-year-old. You may go ahead, which doesn't necessarily mean it is a 20-year-old on average, which is kind of sometimes how the industry tend to say it. It doesn't necessarily mean that. It could be younger than 20, it could be older than 20. You can't be much younger than 20. You can't be much older than 20 to achieve the style. They're pretty good at it. They're pretty consistent in the way they evaluate the wines. But as a consumer, you really don't know what you're getting. And that's the reality. It's not perfect. Not a perfect system, to be honest. But it is a system that has worked very well, and it continues to be.
Cool. Thank you very much. Pretty extensive and professional explanation, as I expected. I still have one question, because obviously also what you mentioned, we haven't really touched on white port, but I think it's a very minor proportion, also not only of the production, but also what wine professionals are expected to know of. But there is another, or actually a very important term in terms of port production, and I think it's Beneficio. Can you talk a little bit about that, and what are the most important, maybe insider knowledge, what we should know about Beneficio?
I knew this was coming. It's always a WSET special. The Beneficio is again, it's a part of the production. It's a part of port, and here between the two of us, obviously it's going to be public, but I have no problem in saying it. I would like the WSET to focus on things that are far more important than the Beneficio. Yes, it's a fundamental aspect of port, but it doesn't speak to consumers. It speaks to trade. It speaks to the wine geeks like ourselves and the wine students, but to the public, it doesn't really matter. But it is a fundamental part of the port industry. So Beneficio it's effectively a grant given by the IVDP, by the authority, for the yearly production of port. So you looking at stock levels from the industry and looking at sales. The IVDP, and obviously there's a discussion within the trade. The IVDP will come out every year saying this year there will be X pipas. That's usually the scale. So 550 liters per pipa per barrel. So there will be X pipas that the industry can fortify, and depends on the vineyard quality. That's where the classification A to G comes into play. Some are outside the classification, but the higher grades have Beneficio. The lower grades are not entitled to Beneficio. So the better, it's a way to incentivize quality. So the more higher letters you have, the more you are authorized to produce port, if you wish to do so. So you're given a paper as a producer. Let's say you have 1 hectare of vineyard.
Mhm.
And a hectare will allow you to produce 5 or 6 people. And you're given and all your hectare produces port. You're given a paper that allows you to make that hectare and then fortify that hectare.
Hmm.
And you are paid to produce. All right. So along with the beneficio, there's a payment,
Mhm.
which is higher for higher letters, lower or inexistent for the lower letter. So if you're a letter A, you get more money. Letter B, a little less. Letter C, you get a bit more,
Mhm.
a bit less, and so on. And so you can take that money. With that money, obviously, you pay the harvest, you pay your costs, and then you produce the port, and then you can sell the port or bottle yourself. So this is the sort of the model. So then there is the other model, which is I have a hectare. I don't want to vinify my grapes. I don't have a winery. So I'm going to sell my grapes and my paper to those producers that would like to have more wine to produce for brands or for whatever it may be. So the bigger players, ourselves included, but all the other main companies will often buy from farmers their grapes and their beneficio.
Mhm.
Because we have needs to produce the more volume-driven stuff. And we have need for those grapes and that beneficio.
Mhm.
So we have our own beneficio, but we'll also go into the market to buy that brand to produce. So this is all very good. The law comes in the 30s, and it has a very interesting social benefit, because if you are a farmer and you've got a couple of hectares and that's your living, unfortunately grapes are paid pretty low in the door. It's a bit of a structural issue, but the beneficio is a very good amount of money for the farmer to be able to sustain its capacity, its livelihood, and not just abandon the vineyards and go elsewhere. So the beneficio has that added sort of social benefit, if you want. It impacts the livelihood of a lot of farmers that otherwise, and I'm going to get there, otherwise they wouldn't be able. The downside of it is that it artificially keeps the prices of those grapes high. Because if you didn't have the beneficio accompanied by a payment, right? If you just had the grant to produce and then sell, the market would dictate the value of those grapes or those wines. And then it would eventually self-balance. Where it would sit at the end of that self-balance, no one quite knows. But that there's voices in the industry that would like to keep the beneficio. There are voices in the industry that would not want the beneficio and let the free market dictate the price of the grapes. There's an added element here, which is the dry wines, the still wines. Let's say instead of 1 hectare of beneficio, I had half hectare of beneficio, and the other hectare I did not have beneficio. I still had grapes, right? What do I do with those grapes that don't have beneficio? I'm not being paid. I don't have the paper. I'm not being paid for those grapes. So you have half hectare, which grapes are incredibly valuable because of the beneficio, and you have half hectare of grapes without beneficio that are worth whatever the market is ready to pay, but it's very, very low. So the beneficio subsidizes, in a way, the grapes for still wine. And that's why, at the moment, a lot of the still wine grapes are being sold so cheap. So, at least that is the argument of those against the beneficio. And I tend to agree with that assessment. It's a very difficult one, very polarizing. But the beneficio does indirectly affect the prices of the dorés, still red whites. And that's why there's a lot of people selling doré grapes, the still ones, at too low price, below what they actually cost.
Mm-hmm.
So if you would take out the Beneficio, these grapes would have to go up in price.
Mm-hmm.
And again, the market would self-adjust, but there would be a big reframing of the Dodo industry. The price on shelves would go up across the and so this is another concern, or not, because the direction of the Dodo should be making premium wines, not making entry-level stuff. The region does not have the yields or the low cost to compete. And so there is this sort of weird situation where the port industry subsidizes the Dodo while keeping things a bit artificial on both sides.
Every coin has two sides, right? So for us, for example, sommeliers, or also consumers, it's very advantageous, because I think the Douro wines, the red wines, are basically a steal. But it is basically a steal, right? It's of course for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But again, the other side says, if you would take the Beneficio, a lot of the farmers would probably just give up and say, well, I'm out. Or not. If the market was prepared to pay higher for the Dodo wines, and eventually that high payment would go down to the farmers, excellent.
Yeah.
But who knows, right? Is the market prepared? I don't know, frankly. But I think there's work in the industry to continue building premium credentials with the Dodo. That's where the region has to be there. It cannot compete with the great majority of the wine world. We cannot compete in price. So we got to push up the profile of the region, and eventually that question might not be a problem anymore. But it's who knows? A bit utopical, but that is the end goal eventually. Cutting out of Beneficio would be problematic. It would all be a bit of a. No one knew very well where things would stabilize at. But it would certainly be what in the future needs to happen sooner or later.
What are the biggest trends for what you see now in terms of port? So in terms of sales and also in terms of production, how is the market changing for port wine?
Look, it's no denying that the volumes of port have been on a lowering trend. There's no, there's no hiding it. So if you look at the overall port sales, they have been gradually declining. The good news goes along what I was saying. The good news is that the Douro is premiumizing. So especially on port, you start to see the lower end of the scale, the entry level, decreasing. But which is usually the French market, the Belgian market, which are more of the aperitif, older consumers. What you do see is the premium market, the Ruby Reserves, the LBBs, the 10, 20, particularly these four, going in very much in the right direction. And so you have less consumption, but those consuming are premium, are moving up the scale. Particularly 10 and 20 have seen massive growth. And it's been the success story for the industry of the last 10, 15 years. And so that is the right direction that the industry needs to move on. And then you've got a lot of different innovation, which is the other end. You've got the rosé port that came out a few years ago. Croft created that. You got port in a can, which was created by a very tiny producer, Aguardente de Sa, and then you have a few other guys following, including ourselves with Coburn's until recently. Then you've got the very special releases of very old stuff, like we had the 1882 grams Nubly, really interesting, successful, people paying luxury prices for port, great packaging. So there's cocktail, there's some port and tonic, new things that are coming out. There's we did a Graham's blend series, number 5, number 12, that look fantastic. They look exactly what young people want to see in a bar. So there is an innovative atmosphere now in the port industry, which is just great to see. We'll see. Look, the industry from the outside and the fortified wine world from the outside might look like, where is it going? The consumers are drinking less, whatever. Overall, if you look at the value side, it's a resilient industry and doing what it needs to be doing. So there's hope that actually the category has legs to continue its path towards where it needs to go, remain in consumers' eyes, remain with the right distribution, and I think we've remained pretty positive. At the same time that you see the Dodo growing really, really well, and beginning, as you say, to show the world that there's really good stuff making, with its pricing, yet to be completely sort of decided, as we were talking before. But in terms of quality of delivers, people are recognizing it as truly a fine wine region. So pretty exciting times on both angles. One slightly decreasing but premiumizing, the other one increasing in volume and premiumizing. So pretty cool.
Well, I also just have three new cocktails actually, on the menu with port wine, two with red and one with white. But you already mentioned the port wine. But also, if you mix it if you have a talented mixer at the bar, it's a very versatile product, and you can utilize it as you want. And also, then you have trends on the market which are basically screaming the opposite of what port actually represents, like the sweetness and the high alcohol, right? And the market trend is the quite opposite. But on the other hand, it's I'm just happy to hear that you are positive. And
I am. I mean, look, we have to be. We have to be, right? But I am positive, especially because you're absolutely right. People are going towards low sugar, lower alcohol. That's a trend, right? When consumers are actually consuming that, that's the other big issue. Is young consumers are drinking less wine than my generation was at their age, and so it's a worry for the wine industry. But I do think that there's a space for every category, as long as the category remains active and relevant. And if we stayed in our little port world and said, no, we are drank after dinner under candlelit lights and with a cigar, and only men drink it, women have to leave the room. I mean, if we that would be the 19th century view, and if we stayed there, we'd be dead, and we deserved it. We would deserve to lose this fight. And so we need to keep. We need to be trendy, as trendy port can be, but we need to be relevant in the eyes of the younger consumer. And we're doing every bit that we can. And I think cycles come and go, and styles come and go, but the classics tend to stay. And if you're true to yourself, if you don't touch the basic side of who you are, yes, you got to keep innovating. Yes, you got to continue to be, follow some of the trends, but who you are should change, and we're not changing that. Trying to adapt by maintaining the basic framework of the port world. And I think eventually be consistent and be active. You got to be in the market. People will recognize that, and there are people who are happy to follow the great classics. And port is a classic. I think there will always be the interest of the consumer to at least try a classic. I'm hopeful.
Cool. And also the industry and the Symington family should be grateful that people like you are representing this fine product. So till they have these talented people, then the candle of hope is lighting.
Thank you, man.
Cool.
Thank you.
George, thank you very much. It was it was a great deep dive, I think, and a lot of internal knowledge what we got to hear in this episode. So thank you very much, and I wish you great success with your Symington wines in the future.
Very kind, Mate. Thank you for having me again. And anytime. And make sure to go to the door.
Yeah, I will. I need some sunshine anyway. So cool. Thank you.
Have a good day. Thank you.